go ahead and get started. Does anybody know who this line's from? It's deja vu all over again. It's gonna break my heart if nobody knows this.
Is your heart's broken?
What's that?
Is your heart's broken?
It is broken. Yogi Berra. For those of y'all who don't know who Yogi Berra is, you need to go look at him. He'll give you a whole bunch of lines that you can use throughout your whole life. And I'm not even going to do him justice, so I won't even try to replicate him. But go figure him out. Go listen to him. All right, what did we learn last time? What's that?
The types.
Yes. Wow. What do you mean different types of memory?
Okay, that's like, look, how we remember things.
Okay.
How we can't remember things.
And how can we remember things?
There's chunks. Split it up.
Yeah. So one of them's chunking, right?
There's method of looking.
Yep. So somebody give me an example of chunking. Somebody else. Yeah.
When you were using words like say bad, CTC and whatever Shelby's functions are, but like say you chunk them like that instead of chunking them into odd letters that you're not going to remember.
Yeah, exactly. So instead of having a continuous string of numbers or letters, breaking it into smaller chunks, right? So that's what they do with phone numbers. It becomes a lot easier to remember a phone number. If you have 3, 3, and 4, then if you just give 10 straight digits. Method of loci, or loci, or loci, or whatever you want to call it. What is that? Yeah. Oh. Go ahead.
When you like see in your head, you see your house and you associate different things with furniture and people and such to help you remember.
Yeah, so this is one of the techniques they use for the memory championships, things like where they have to memorize a deck of cards. And so by creating some sort of framing around something that's personal to you, it becomes easier to remember them rather than remembering, 7 of clubs, 8 of diamonds, king of spades, whatever. You're remembering people in different rooms of your house to kind of create a narrative, create a story. What else did we learn? Yeah.
The testing effect.
The testing effect, yes. Thank you. And what is the testing effect?
When you test yourself, you'll do much better when you're recalling it later, when you're practicing doing your recall rather than just recognition, rereading.
Yeah. And roughly, how much of a benefit does the testing effect give you?
A letter grade.
Yeah, between like a letter grade and a half and 2 letter grades, right? So I don't want to call anybody dumb, but if you're choosing not to use it, that would not be the smartest way of going about studying. What else we learned? I think I heard something.
Sensory memory, short-term memory.
Yes. Yeah, and short-term memory is referring to about what span of time? Yeah, 20, 30 seconds, right? So anything beyond that is long-term memory. Is that a question or? Yeah.
No.
Oh, okay. Give me one other thing we discussed. Yeah.
We learned about the three-stage model of memory and its flaws and or things that it helps.
Yeah. So let's unpack that a little bit. Who's attributable to that 3-stage model? What names? Does anybody remember? Yeah, Atkinson and Shiffrin. All right. And what is that 3-stage model itself? Somebody kind of break it out.
And demonstrates the difference between sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory.
Yeah, so what is sensory memory? Somebody else. Yeah.
It's like a fractional sentence where you got something and you don't pay attention to it and it goes away.
Yeah, so it's inherent to that sensory system, right? And so the example we gave was that 3x3 grid of letters. And if you're not cued to pay attention to a certain column or row, you'll forget it. But you have that split second wherein it's retained in the sensory system that you can then pay attention, access it, and then transfer to working memory, right? So what is working memory? Or short-term memory itself? What's that? Yeah, so the rehearsal loop is absolutely part of it, but working memory itself refers to kind of that stage wherein you're accessing the information, you're manipulating the information, you're thinking about it, it's kind of in your mind. The process by which information goes from working in short-term memory to long-term memory is called what? What's that? Or encoding, yep. And then what's the process by which you're pulling information from long-term memory into working memory?
Retrieval.
Retrieval, awesome. And then what were some of the issues we had with the three-stage model? Yeah?
Is it talk about anything between short-term and long-term as well as different short-terms and long-terms that are?
Okay, yeah, so how do we know there's anything between short-term and long-term?
I mean, you don't just immediately forget everything you've ever thought.
Yeah, well, so you don't forget everything you've ever thought, and we gave another concrete example in class. What about things like oh, yeah.
I was just about to say.
I'm sure you were.
It just came to my mind.
I'm kidding. Yeah, so tip of the tongue, right? So you have kind of this partial retrieval of you know it, but you can't fully recover it, right? And so there seems to be this kind of intermediary stage. Awesome. Any questions about what we covered last time? Nothing? Awesome. Awesome. Fun fact of the day. In the obituary of Scott, we'll say Ensminger, a lifelong Cleveland Browns fan and season ticket holder, he, quote, respectfully requested 6 Cleveland Brown pallbearers so the Browns can let him down one last time. Isn't that great? As a Redskins fan, I feel it. That's awful. All right. On to memory, round 2. So first we're going to talk about it at the synaptic level, right? Everything we talked about was kind of this amorphous discussion of memory last time. But learning is essentially the enhancement of efficiency between this neuronal transmission, right? You're solidifying the connection between different points in the brain. And so part of that can be more connections actually forming. And what do we call the formation of synapses?
Synaptogenesis.
Synaptogenesis, yes, exactly. But then you also have a process of priming, and we'll talk about what priming means in a little bit here, or at least what it means in the context of memory. But by priming these neural connections, by saying the name of the street you grew up on, you've enhanced that sensitivity such that it needs less of a signal to subsequently transmit that message again. Right, so this is the process by which, just because you retrieve something and then put it back into long-term memory, it's not equally as difficult to retrieve it the second time. You retrieve it, you've created this enhanced sensitivity for that connection, and now it becomes easier to retrieve in the immediate aftermath. So the increased efficiency throughout these enhanced synaptic connections is what we call long-term potentiation. this helps to explain why the more we practice remembering things, the more we retrieve information, the more we rehearse that information, the less likely it is that we're actually going to forget that information down the line, right? Because we've established these connections, we've built a stronger, bigger highway for that information to be retrieved. And again, it also explains why it's easy to retrieve things after you have recently retrieved it before. I've heard different numbers, but things like you need 80 retrievals to submit something in your memory forever. Now, in reality, nothing is in your memory forever. But you'll notice that even if you feel confident about something, let's take a test, for example. You feel confident in your memory. You've worked on retrieving it, a lot of the rehearsal. 10 years down the line, you may not be able to retrieve that information because you haven't continued to establish that connection at the synaptic level. And so we'll talk about 4 different things that enhance or affect memory retrieval: priming, context-dependent memory, state-dependent memory, and then the serial position effect. All right. Repeat after me and then answer my question. Say silk 5 times fast. What do cows drink? Water. Cows make milk. They drink water, right? And so what we've done with this example is primed you to give a certain response, right? By saying silk, 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 it's now primed similar words in your mind that end with this kind of ilk. The association of cows is usually milk. And so you answer a fairly easy question with an obviously stupid and wrong answer. I'm not calling you stupid, but cows don't drink milk unless they're a baby. So this priming completely affects your retrieval, your access to information, right? Because so much of our memory is based around this network in our brain rather than specific locations. By activating parts of that network, we are now enhancing the likelihood that wrong information that is tangentially related to that network is pulled from memory. It's also why sometimes you can prime somebody to think of somebody or something, and then you ask for them to provide some sort of estimate, right? And so if before your, what do we call them here, SIEs, before the evaluations at the end of the semester, I say something to the effect of, oh, you remember that time I brought my dogs in? That was so fun. All right, why don't you go ahead and fill out your SIEs. I've now primed you to be thinking about good things, and you're more likely to, in theory, give me higher evaluations in class. You can see how it's kind of interleaved with things like the availability heuristic, right? Things that are easily accessible. So by priming a source of information, we've enhanced the availability of that information for pulling from memory. Who can think of a real-world example in which they have experienced priming or used priming? Yeah,
Sometimes they change, like, they specifically set the order of ads on TV so that, like, you have, like, an ad for, like, really greasy food, and then you have an ad for exercise equipment, and then, like, different ads following so that it sort of
Interesting.
gets you in the mood to buy whatever the next thing is, and then they have, like, pills and then whatever.
that's really interesting. So they've essentially primed you to say, oh, look how good that greasy burger is. And the next ad is, you're probably out of shape. And you say, yeah, because I like greasy burgers. And now you're more likely to, that's interesting. I like that a lot. Yeah, I mean, you can also think about things like if right before I give the exam, I prime you to think about, what is the name of the principle that dictates that a neuron fires either in totality or doesn't fire at all. What do we call that principle, by the way? All or none, right? You're much more likely to retrieve that if given an open-ended question about, tell me about how the neuron fires. So it's that activation, often unconscious, of particular associations in memory. This is also the concept behind the game of Taboo. Has anybody played the game of Taboo? For those of y'all who haven't, somebody explain how the game works.
I haven't played in a while.
Okay.
I know you have a buzzer.
Yes.
You have a certain amount of time, and you're given a card, and it gives you a word, say like chair, and you have to describe that to someone, and they have to guess the word chair, but they give you all like the similar adjectives to chair that you cannot say.
Yeah.
So it's really hard to avoid saying things while you're just trying to go really fast.
Exactly. Yeah. So the word will be chair. I have to get you to guess chair, but the things I can't say are, seat and stool and whatever kind of the most common associations are. But it's not necessarily that it's just the most common associations. You usually look at the word before, the words before, to know what you're not allowed to say. If you say it, you get deducted points. So it's the same concept. If I tell you not to think about an elephant, what are you thinking about? An elephant, right? I've just primed your thought process, even though the instruction was to clearly not think about an elephant. Bless you. So context-dependent memory is that it's easier to remember information when it was encoded in the same environment in which you were trying to retrieve it. I actually meant to change this. This was from my slides when I was at the Air Force Academy. Chances are most of you are not in uniform at any point in our interactions. But let's change this and say, the context in which I interact with all of y'all is as comfortably dressed college students. And if I'm downtown and y'all are dressed up to go out downtown, chances are I'm not going to recognize you, in part because of the context of what you're wearing, but also the context of where we are, right? If I see you in the classroom, I'm much more likely to recognize you. If I see you out in Huntsville, say I recognize him, but I don't know why I know that person. So this is the whole principle. Whoopsies. This is the whole principle behind practice as you play. And so what is the context in which you are encoding that information? And they established this as an effect by having divers go underwater and just read a word list, right? So they were underwater, they read a word list, and then for half the divers, they pulled them out of the water. The other half they left in the water and said, okay, recall that word list. And those who stayed in the water recalled more words than did those who came out of the water. So even though there was something, or even though there was nothing different about the amount of time that had elapsed or their means of communication, it was still the case that because they had encoded those words in a specific context underwater, they were able to better recall it because they were still in that context. And so it makes sense for you, when you're studying, to come to this classroom and actually study in this classroom for this test. you're more likely to recall information if you are encoding it in the environment where you are recalling it. Another reason why you shouldn't just stay at home and watch the lecture videos, but instead come to class. There's an enhancement there. Interestingly enough, I can't remember the name of the authors that did this study. Bless you. But they did this scuba diving study down in, I think it was the Bahamas. And one of my former graduate school advisors ran into the author and asked them why they did it there rather than doing it really in any other situation. And the author realized because if they wrote a grant, they could get a funding agency to pay for them to go spend time in the Bahamas while they did research. So it was an impressive study, it was an important study, but this just goes to show if you're good enough at persuading people in academia, you can get essentially all expenses paid trips to nice locations to do research. In addition to this context, so the environment in which you're in, we have what we call state-dependent memory effects. So the state in which you encode something is the state in which retrieval is the highest. So an anecdotal example for me, I didn't really start playing pool until after I turned 21. And most of the places you go play pool also have alcohol, right? You usually drink while you're playing pool. And I noticed after a while that the first couple games I would play at the pool hall, I tended not to play as well as after I had a couple drinks to then play, right? It's because so much of the practice had occurred after a drink or two that the actual retrieval of this sort of implicit memory was highest after I had a drink or two. And so if you are in a state of stress during an exam, it may make sense for you to try to elevate your stress level, at least in part, when studying, because you're going to have an enhanced recall of that information when the recall state you're in matches that encoding state you are in. It's also another principle behind kind of that practice as you play. If you want to create as much of a game-like environment in the actual practice of those skills as you'll have in the real world. And so if you've ever gone to Auburn or Tuscaloosa middle week, you'll sometimes hear the loudspeakers blasting noise while the team's practicing. And they'll have the teams lining up alongside the field goal kickers and yelling at them to try to get this sort of anxiety inducement for the players, such that when it comes time for them to actually perform under pressure, they've encoded those skills under pressure. But not just in this sort of implicit memory. Negative moods make you more likely to remember negative events, right? And so this kind of snowballs. You have a negative mood, you remember negative events, you become more negative, you remember more negative, etc. Right? So that's why one of the best things you can do when you're down in the dumps is to force yourself to smile, and we'll talk about things like embodied cognition another time. But force yourself to remember positive things, because as you become more positive and happier, you tend to recall more positive and happier things. And so you can actually force your way out of these bad moods purely by manipulating your cognition. So if any of you have friends that are just Debbie Downers or negative, I don't know what a masculine end name besides Nate is. I don't want to call myself negative. I'll say negative Nates. See, I was primed to think of my own name, but just tell them to be happy. And say, I can't just be happy. I mean, obviously, clinical depression is different, but you can tell them to be happy and make them be happy. All right, so given everything we've talked about so far in this class and last class's memory lecture, how should you go about studying for your test? Talk with your neighbor, and then we will bring it all back together.
I was studying for painting yesterday, and this was like, plus I had this
Right, Dad?
I think only the ones that show someone's there are like
Alright, my biology, computer science.
31 more seconds. Do not trust that it's not going to keep working. What's the definition of insanity? Yeah. All right. Inform me. How should I study for my test if I were one of you? Yeah.
I guess it's like you need to know words or something, like prime yourself to do it.
Yeah.
With the, saying the 5 times and 30 times.
Yeah, so you can prime yourself, right? So it's not a good idea to cram, but maybe the last few minutes before the exam, going through the concepts you've had the most trouble with. What else? Yeah.
When you do a little practice test at home, try and make the environment similar to that of the actual test.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe give yourself some sort of time pressure, but also make it a quiet environment, or just pay your roommate to sit right next to you and sniffle. I swear to God, there is an exponential growth of sniffles as we get close to exam time. Yeah, what else? Yeah, so maybe your best bet would be coming here and studying in this actual environment, maybe in the seat you think you will be taking the exam in. And what time of day should you come do that? Yeah, roughly about this time, right? Now, why would the time of day matter? Yeah, I heard somebody say, oh, excitedly. I don't know if it was pertaining to class or something else, but yeah, right? You have your circadian rhythm throughout the day, right? This is actually a really tough time to have class because unless you've eaten lunch right before, you tend to be kind of getting to a low point in your energy levels. And so try to keep it consistent with how you're studying and how you're taking the test. What else? Yeah?
Reading your material just once and then test how much you know about it.
Yes.
And then reading again and then saying note.
Yeah.
Remember it.
Exactly. So really utilizing that testing effect such that you give yourself an open-ended prompt and write everything you can, compare that to your notes, go back, compare your response to your notes to establish what you need to relearn. Anything else? Yeah?
You could read a slide through your voice.
You can read the slides in my voice. Give it a shot. Try to interpret me. Interpret me. That's not what I meant to say. It was a weird Freudian slip. One of the reasons I hate listening to myself is I think I've got a really nasally voice when I listen to it. But in my head, I sound like, Barry White. I'm like, oh, that's impressive. And I listen to it, I'm like, there must have been something wrong with the recorder. And then people say, no, that's how you actually sound. And it hurts my soul. And so, thank you for not grabbing your nose and trying to interpret me. Impersonate. Yes. All right. So yeah, you can study stressed, study in the classroom, study over time. Nobody said spacing. Test yourself, testing effect, etc. All right. Quick class activity. Either on your computer or on a piece of paper, write down every president of the United States that you know. Yes, that you know personally. That you can remember. Six more seconds. All right, somebody give me a president.
John Adams.
Adams. Senior. Okay, give me another one. Yeah.
Andrew Jackson.
Jackson, good one. The most profane, except for maybe Johnson. Give me another one. Yeah.
Theodore Roosevelt.
Roosevelt. Give me another one. Washington. Just shout them out. JFK. Did I hear Beyonce? Bo. Carter. Trump. Lincoln.
George H.W. Bush.
HW. NW. Nixon.
James Buchanan.
Buchanan, that's obscure. I like that. That's good. Truman.
That's on my list.
FDR. Ray. Whoopsies. Hey, again.
Nixon.
I already said Bush. I already said Nixon. Huh? Harrison. Taft.
Tyler.
All right, we're now getting into the obscure ones. I'm impressed. All right. Wasn't Harrison the one who died? So, William Henry Harrison is the greatest example of somebody whose ego literally killed him. For those of y'all who don't know, he gave like a mini-hour, what's the word I'm looking for? Inauguration speech in the freezing rain. Wound up getting pneumonia and then died like 2 weeks later because of the pneumonia. The end. All right. So what's some of the things we notice about this list? It's short, yes. Doesn't include Beyonce. Yeah.
Trump took a lot longer to get to than I thought he would.
Okay, well that's, yes. What else? Yeah.
They're all really known for something.
Yeah, they're all really known for something, right?
Except Adams.
Yeah. So, one of the things that's going to dictate people's lists is if that president occurred recently, right? So we have Trump, we have Barack Obama, we have W. Nobody said Clinton, which surprised me. Oh, did you? Okay, I didn't hear it. Well, I'm going to pretend like nobody said it. Yeah, so we have Clinton, H.W., Carter, and Reagan, right? And then it starts to drop off. But then we also have at the very beginning, right? Washington, Adams. I didn't hear anybody say Jefferson, but I'm sure somebody did. Getting too mad at me. I don't like it. I'm kidding. Yeah, so Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe were the first five, right? And then the rest of them in the middle are all known for something, right? What was JFK known for? Getting shot, right? Yeah. What was Truman known for? Dropping the bomb, right? What was Nixon known for? Watergate, right? What was Buchanan known for the one person who got Buchanan? I think it came from this side of the room.
He had like the shortest term ever. He had like a really short term on that. And he was only in there for like a few months.
Well, he wasn't in for that long, but he was unequivocally the worst president we've ever had in that he let half the country secede. So, anybody who tells you there's a worse president than that, is clearly, huh?
Where's the name you get?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
100%.
Jackson did things.
Jackson beat a man almost to death with a fire iron. That's awesome. All right, we're getting sidetracked. We're getting sidetracked.
Most awesome president is still Roosevelt.
No, we're getting sidetracked.
Well, it is.
We're getting sidetracked. Everybody shut up. All right. We're going on and we're talking about science now. All right. So this serves to illustrate what we call the serial position effect. The likelihood that you remember the beginning of the list and the end of the list are called the primacy and recency effects. So we tend to remember the first five, or at least the first couple. It tends to be easier to remember the more recent ones, in part because you may have lived through some of the presidencies, or you at least hear them talked about in a way that has relevance to your life. But we do have the ability to remember ones in the middle, right? We can all remember Lincoln pretty easily. We can all usually remember at least one of the Roosevelts, FDR, Teddy. We can usually remember JFK. Remembering Truman becomes a little easier if you are fascinated with military history. And so it tends to be the presidents that have something distinguishing about their tenure in office that helps us remember them. All right? We don't have a hard time remembering the ones who were assassinated because there weren't that many. It's a pretty, thankfully, rare event, but that makes it a very salient individual in history. And so where things exist in a list changes your ability to remember them. But one of the other interesting things is that a really salient figure can elevate the likelihood that you remember those around them, right? And so if it weren't for Lincoln, most people probably wouldn't be able to get Buchanan. Still may be able to. But the fact that Buchanan immediately preceded Lincoln makes it much more likely that we are able to remember Buchanan. Did anybody say Tyler? Yes. Do you know all the presidents? Wow, that's impressive. That's awesome. Yes. So Tyler is an amazingly, well, we won't get into it. He was a drunkard. All right. So we tend to remember things at the beginning of the list. We tend to remember things at the end of lists. And if there's something really salient about the middle of the list, we tend to be better able to remember it. But we also tend to forget things over time, right? At one point, you probably learned every one of the presidents. Who's the only president to sit on the Supreme Court? Taft. See? That's something you're going to remember now. Probably not. Yeah, so several things can contribute to forgetting. Amnesia. We'll talk about that. Encoding failure. Right? So what would an encoding failure be? Yeah.
Failing to remember something?
Yeah, so failing to transition it from that short-term memory to that long-term memory. Storage decay, right? So if you've got things in your memory you haven't thought about in a while, it's going to be a lot harder for you to recall it. And then just general retrieval failure. Even if you know something, or you know something, the inability to retrieve and pull that information out of memory. So there are two different types of amnesia. One is called anterograde amnesia, and this is the inability to form new memories. There is a really kind of debilitating case of a man named Clive Waring, and you can go watch videos online. But he has about a 5-second memory, right? Between 5 and 30 seconds. Pretty much anything that he's keeping in his mind actively, but he's unable to form any new memories, right? And so he's got this diary that he writes in repeatedly, and it's filled with things like, this is the first moment I'm aware, right? Because for just a period of his life and his mind, he's just missing information. So he thinks he woke up. This is the first time he's become aware of, being out of his coma. Even though he's never been in a coma, he just hasn't been able to form memories for, I think at the point where there was a documentary on him, like 20 years. And so he was still able to remember certain things from before. I think he had some sort of viral illness, suffered a heat stroke, and I think had subsequent damage in his brain's ability to form those new memories. So he was able to remember his wife. He was able to remember playing the piano, things like that, but wasn't able to solidify those new memories. So anterograde is from kind of the incident forward, no new memories. Retrograde amnesia is the inability to retrieve information from the past. Right? And so this is the example. Sometimes you'll hear sensationalized accounts on the news of somebody pops up and doesn't know who they are. Right? They're able to form new memories, but just nothing from before that event is retrievable. Now you can have really kind of temporary and small examples of anterograde or retrograde. Right? If you hit your head really hard, you may not remember for a few minutes after the event or a few minutes before, but that usually dissipates. But it still is emblematic of these types of amnesia. Now there is a shocking percentage of people who think that if memory is lost due to a blow on the head, all you have to do is hit him on the head again to retrieve the memories. You guys laugh, but we're talking substantial double digits of American adults think this is true. For the love of God, if your friend is struggling to remember something, don't hit him over the head again. That does not reverse the effects of amnesia. This is my public service announcement. Please don't beat your friends to death trying to help them remember. And this is actually one of the processes by which things like amnesia work, right? Anesthesia work, right? So in certain contexts, they actually want you to be awake. The surgeons or the doctors want you to be awake, but they don't want you to be aware or have kind of the unpleasant memories associated with the event. And so they'll give you anesthesia that will prevent you from making new memories for a short period of time, right? They'll give you anterograde amnesia such that you can't remember the procedure, but you're still able to interact with the doctors themselves to provide sorts of feedback. About a decade ago, I had a procedure done where they gave me one of these forms of anesthesia, and it was a weird experience coming out of that sort of anesthesia, such that all I remember is like coming to, and what I thought was very cleverly saying good morning to my mom. It wasn't morning, it was like mid-afternoon, but I was like, oh, I'm awake. Apparently I had said that same thing like 12 times in a row. I just had forgotten that I had said it, and she was less than amused that I kept going through this same dog and pony show. But yeah, so that's one of the principles by which anesthesia work. They're just preventing you from solidifying these sorts of memories. You also have encoding failures. So the efficiency of encoding decays with age. Right? So that's partially one of the reasons why when new things happen with your grandparents, they may not remember those things happening. However, even when healthy or young, if you're not remembering something, it may be that you never fully encoded what that was. Right? And so you may have these sorts of phenomena like you know you should know it, or you think you know it, but you never went through that process of actually encoding the mechanism necessary to encode that information into your long-term memory stores. Alright, so take a second, look at all of these pennies, and figure out which letter you think is the actual penny. Don't look at a real penny. Alright, we're going to do a quick show of hands. We're going to go through all of them. Raise your hand, A. Raise your hand, B. C. D. E. F. You have to vote. G. H. I. J. K. L. M. N. O. Who has no clue? Who thought A again? Yeah, y'all are right. It's A. Yeah. Right? And so even though
That was close.
y'all have many years of interacting with pennies, you've never really encoded what a penny looks like. Right? It's not really that relevant to know exactly how a penny looks like. It's not your job to identify fake pennies. And what you find is people really do struggle with this. People know certain components of it. They know Lincoln's on the penny. They almost all know that In God We Trust is on the penny, that the word liberty is on the penny, that the year is on the penny. But nobody really remembers what the configuration of those things are. Now, I need a brave volunteer who has Apple products. All right, come on down here. And without looking back at the class, draw on that board what the Apple logo looks like.
I can't draw them.
That's all right. Doesn't have to be perfect.
So it's an apple, and then there's a bite out of it.
All right. Who thinks she's wrong to some degree? All right. Why don't you come on down and draw your own? Yeah. I realize this. Man, I hate this. Don't bonk your head on it. I don't want to give you amnesia, then you hit your head again. All right. And now, who still thinks that neither of these are the answer?
The second one's closer.
Anybody? So I actually don't know. Somebody who's got an Apple product. Man, I'm blinded.
Except for
You know.
one.
Okay, yeah. So you've got this little leaf going off to the right here. The bite's on the correct side. People usually, if they're going to miss something, they flip the bite, and then having that little divot there on the bottom. Right? And so this was another example where you can interact with logos all the time and not necessarily have a good idea as to what it should actually look like. And so your retention drops off immediately for anything that you are, in fact, learning. Right? So you go from 100% at the immediate retrieval to within 20 minutes for getting over 40% of what you've learned. Which always makes me feel good when y'all leave this room realizing that half of the things I'm saying you're not going to remember. I know. And then it starts to flatten out such that at times you're only remembering about a quarter of things. And now this is you remembering a quarter of things that you're paying attention to. This is not including all the times that you're off daydreaming. Right? And so data also suggests that about a third of people at any given time are off in their head daydreaming or thinking about something else, which also doesn't make me feel good as an instructor. And so multiply that 2/3 of information by the quarter that you're going to retain, and we start getting down to very low numbers. But yeah, you can see that almost immediately, unless you are going through this rehearsal and this forced encoding, right, you're going to lose a lot of that information. So retrieval failure can be full or partial, right? You can have partial retrieval of information. You know some things, but you don't know others. Right? I was just on the phone with a company who wanted to know what address I moved from, and even though I just moved from there less than a year ago, I could remember the street name, but I couldn't remember the house number, and so I had that partial retrieval, but not the full retrieval, even though they were pretty much solidified together. So for example, what was the name of the lead actor on The Sopranos? I'll give you a hint, it's not this guy. I don't actually know. I think it's James Gandolfini, but I don't know that for sure. Alright? And this is related to the tip of the tongue phenomena. Like you know it, but you can't retrieve it. Show of hands. Who knows they know this actor? I guarantee most of y'all have at least seen him. What's his name? You gotta remember? I think it's Forrest Whitaker, isn't it? Alright, somebody look it up. I should have verified this before because now I'm second guessing myself.
You were right about the Sopranos.
Boom! It's right about The Sopranos. Alright, so I think that's Forrest Whitaker. But, so you have these circumstances where you know the person, right? Maybe you do this all the time with movies of, oh God, what was the guy's name in, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind? I can see him, but I can't remember his name, right? So you have that tip of the tongue phenomena where it's right there, you just can't fully retrieve it into your consciousness in a way that subsequently allows you to reproduce it. Anybody look it up? Is it in fact Forrest Whitaker? Yes, man, 2 for 2. Should be proud because I put these slides together, but still. And so last time we talked about memory being reconstructive rather than reproductive. What would reproductive memory look like? Yeah?
It would be like almost as if it was recorded rather than thought about.
Exactly. Yeah, so reproductive memory is as if you recorded something and then played it back. Right? So a tape recorder, a movie camera, what your computers do. But our memory is reconstructed. Right? So every time we access memory, we change it just a little bit. And this is one of the most startling things for most people in psychology environments, when you realize that your memory for your life is not always exactly as things happen. Right? We talked a little bit last time about disputes you may have with siblings. I know that happened to me. No, it happened to my siblings. But you can frequently distort memories, even if you're not intending to. Have false memories, right? Memories that are implanted in your head. We'll talk about some examples of that. And memory that can also be manipulated, right? So I can take something that really happened to you and change a little bit of that story until you become convinced that those changes actually happened to you. And so misinformation can, even if it is not part of that initial event, can affect, can alter, change, or create a false memory. Right? And so one of the early studies on this was by a researcher named Elizabeth Loftus. And depending on time, we may show a little TED Talk excerpt from her. But showed a video of a car crash. And based off of that, they asked participants one of several questions. How fast were the cars going when they bumped into each other, when they crashed into each other, or when they smashed into each other? Right? All they did was change the wording of this question by using one of those 3 words. And what they found is people's memory for how fast the cars were going during that car accident changed dramatically, such that my recollection is those in the smashed condition actually remembered the cars going about twice as fast as those in the bumped condition. Right? So by simply changing the word I'm asking, I'm priming you with a certain expectation for that memory that subsequently distorts your memory for what happened. They'll also do studies where they implant a memory, a false memory, of a time you got lost in a mall. And so one of the things they'll do is say, all right, I talked to your parents and they told me about this time you got lost in the mall, even though that event never happened. They don't tell the person that event never happened. But they say, your parent told me about this time you were lost in the mall. Do you remember that? And they sit and think. All of a sudden, yeah, I do remember that. Say, that must have been pretty scary, right? Yeah, it was really scary. So tell me about what happened. It's an event that never happened, and yet in their mind, it actually did happen, right? So by implanting this suggestion, this idea, especially from what they perceive to be a reliable source of their parents, you can put this memory for something that never happened in the memory of, I think in this case it was college students, but anybody. So here are some examples of collective false memories we have. Memories of things that are not true, but as a society, we remember them to be true. So the first one, rich Uncle Pennybags, aka the Monopoly Man, has never worn a monocle. Yeah.
Isn't this just the, what's it called again,
I don't remember what the Mandela effect is.
People think Nelson Mandela died in prison.
Ah, okay. Yes, this is probably some component of that. Yeah.
There's also the Berenstein Bears. They're spelled Stain, but everyone remembers it as Stein.
Ah, there you go. Yeah, here.
Here's a good one. Here's George W. He's actually a chicken.
Yeah, that's an easy distinction.
No, people thought he had a tail or didn't have a tail.
I don't remember.
It's one.
All right, here are more of them. The Queen in Snow White never said mirror, mirror on the wall. It was actually magic mirror on the wall. Sarah Palin never said, I can see Russia from my house. That was Tina Fey playing Sarah Palin. Darth Vader says, no, I am your father, rather than Luke, I am your father. We Are the Champions, that song, doesn't end with of the world. And there was no movie about genies featuring Sinbad in the 1990s. You all may be too young for that.
Didn't people confuse it with the Shaquille O'Neal
Yes.
movie?
Yeah. Yeah. So none of these actually happened, and yet we have these collective false memories for things that did not, in fact, happen. Does anybody not believe any of this? Which one don't you believe?
The snow owl.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, sorry. it's true.
Wasn't the movie one like called Shazam or something?
Shazam was the Shaquille O'Neal.
No, it was Kazam.
Kazam, excuse me.
Shazam's the
Kazam
DC character.
was with Shaquille O'Neal. Yes.
Also, people think Kit Kat was spelled with a hyphen, but it's not.
Yeah. See, a whole bunch of examples wherein we have these collective false memories, these societal false memories for things that are not actually true. All right, I'm going to give you just a little bit of Elizabeth Loftus's TED Talk speech, and then we will move on because we have a couple more slides after. But all right.
At the intersection, not a stop sign. And you might be thinking, well, you know, these are filmed events, they're not particularly stressful, would the same kind of mistakes be made with a really stressful event? In a study we published just a few months ago, we have an answer to this question. Because what was unusual about this study is we arranged for people to have a very stressful experience. The subjects in the study were members of the U.S. military who were undergoing a harrowing training exercise to teach them what it's going to be like for them if they are ever captured as prisoners of war. And as part of this training exercise, these soldiers are interrogated in an aggressive, hostile, physically abusive fashion for 30 minutes. And later on, they have to try to identify the person who conducted that interrogation. And when we feed them suggestive information that insinuates it's a different person, many of them misidentify their interrogator, often identifying someone who doesn't even remotely resemble the real interrogator. And so what these studies are showing is that when you feed people misinformation about some experience that they may have had, you can distort or contaminate or change their memory. But out there in the real world, misinformation is everywhere. We get misinformation not only if we're questioned in a leading way, but if we talk to other witnesses who might consciously or inadvertently feed us some erroneous information, or if we see media coverage about some event we might have experienced. All of these provide the opportunity for this kind of contamination of our memory.
So this serves to highlight the fact that it's not just in these laboratory settings, but actually stressful events, they can feed information into someone's memory, and that just because it's a stressful event and people are told to pay attention to this stuff, doesn't mean that they're not susceptible to these false memories. And again, she talks there about circumstances wherein we can have this kind of mass contamination, right? So one of the first things police officers do is separate witnesses, separate suspects, in part so suspects can't form their story together, but also because you can have your memory quite literally shifted. You can totally believe something that didn't actually happen based off of convincing by other people. Yeah, here we go. And so Elizabeth Loftus became really popular, or unpopular, so to speak, towards the late 90s and early 2000s, because there was this wave of idea of repressed memories. Right? This idea that we had memories that we weren't aware of until they were brought out in therapy. Right? That something may have happened and we completely pushed it into our subconscious, and then we were able to retrieve that information after the fact. And what Elizabeth Loftus and others were suggesting, and then supported by evidence, is that there's no such thing as a repressed memory. Right? We have memories that we sometimes forget, but we don't have memories that we have stored away, completely inaccessible to us, until we go into some sort of hypnotic state. Right? And there are extreme examples. I mean, you have, People Magazine is books themselves all about this. But cases like patients going in, meeting with a therapist believes this person had a repressed memory and was able to, through suggestion, albeit probably unintentionally, led a woman to believe that she was in a satanic cult with no evidence of it. In fact, I think it was this case, the therapist was able to implant in this woman's head that she actually had a baby cut out from her stomach while she was part of this satanic cult. And then you get to the point of looking at physical evidence, and there was not a single scar on her stomach, right? There was no actual affiliation with any sort of satanic cult. And so by planting these memories in somebody's head, you had this massive epidemic of people now being brought up on charges of abuse because of quote-unquote these repressed memories, even when there was no evidence that things like that had actually happened, as a function of, well-meaning therapists and hypnotists unintentionally implanting false memories in people's head. You wound up having people go to prison for a long time before evidence could kind of expunge them for the crimes that they had supposedly committed. But this also ties in to the concept of eyewitness testimony. Right? So eyewitness testimony is one of the most commonly used pieces of evidence in the courtroom. However, as you would suggest, based off of everything we know about memory to this point, it's inherently faulty, right? And so 75% of wrongful convictions, which have been able to be overturned with DNA evidence, rely on mistaken eyewitness identification for that conviction. Now, that's not saying 75% of eyewitness testimonies are wrong, but it is saying that 75% of cases we can prove were a miscarriage of justice were because of eyewitness testimony. People taking the stand and saying, that's the person I saw, when there was no way it could have been that person. There are also horrifying cases wherein people, I'm trying to remember the exact circumstance, but I think there was a guy being interviewed on the news while a horrific abuse crime happened, and the victim wound up identifying the person that was being interviewed on the news because of this confusion, the source confusion of where she knew that person from, right? And so eyewitness testimony is still allowed in the courtroom, despite the fact that it is inherently flawed. And this isn't to say that we should get rid of eyewitness testimony. And this isn't to suggest that eyewitness itself is completely inaccessible to the truth. Right? There are a lot of times where eyewitness testimony is fairly reliable. But people like, there's a professor in the psychology department named Dr. Jeffrey Neuschatz, who gets called to testify at all of these court trials of all of these people who are either on trial or even in things like the Innocence Project, where they have people who they think were wrongfully convicted to come and talk to the jury about just how flawed eyewitness testimony is and the concerns with putting too much weight on it. And so again, this isn't to suggest that memory itself is never accurate. There are a lot of times where it is accurate. This is kind of like the biases and heuristics lecture of your decision making isn't always flawed. In fact, it does a very good job a lot of the time. But it's important to understand that memories are inherently falsifiable, inherently manipulatable, and are not reproductive, but are instead reconstructed. Any questions about what we talked about so far today? Is anybody going to have an existential crisis not knowing what they believe anymore? What happened to them in their lives versus not?
Just slightly.
Just slightly? Yes. Yeah, you get to a point where you're like, I don't know how much I can trust my own mind anymore. That's why all professors are crazy. All right. Have a good weekend. I will see you all on Tuesday.